Most people assume that effective sniper tactics are built around rifles, optics, and precision. They're wrong. One of the deadliest sniper operations in Western Europe during World War II began with something far less impressive. A worn bootlace. Not a modification. Not a weapon upgrade. Not even a piece of equipment meant for combat. And once you understand why that mattered, you'll see how a single American infantryman turned 3 days of fighting into a psychological collapse that killed 64 German soldiers and forced an entire unit to abandon ground it could no longer understand. Because what happened in a rain-soaked forest in October 1944 wasn't about marksmanship. It wasn't about superior firepower. It was about exploiting a reflex so deeply ingrained in trained soldiers that doctrine itself worked against them. The Germans believed they were dealing with a sniper team. They believed they were being flanked, hunted, and surrounded. They believed this because everything they were taught told them that no single man could create that many firing angles, that much confusion, or that level of fear. They were wrong. There was only one American in that forest. No special rank. No reputation. No advanced gear. Just a soldier who understood something most armies still struggle to admit. That fear doesn't come from bullets. It comes from uncertainty. And that, if you can control how an enemy interprets what's happening around him, you don't need to shoot often. Over the next 3 days, German patrols would walk into a battlefield they could no longer read. Not because they were careless, but because they were trained to investigate. And someone had learned how to turn that instinct into a weapon. All it took was patience, terrain, and an object so ordinary no one would ever think to defend against it. A bootlace. October 1944 didn't feel like a month. It felt like a condition. The rain in western Germany didn't simply fall. It lingered. It seeped into seams, rotted canvas, softened bark, and turned every footstep into a signature. Mud wasn't an inconvenience, it was evidence. Evidence that you had moved. Evidence that you had been there. Evidence that someone could follow. Most soldiers treated that environment like a problem to endure. He treated it like a system. That distinction matters, because the bootlace trick, what the Germans would later describe as multiple snipers, and weapons hidden everywhere, was not born from clever hands. It was born from a way of seeing, a way of noticing what other men ignored because they were busy trying not to die. He wasn't a famous marksman. He didn't arrive in Europe with a reputation. He arrived like thousands of others. A U.S. infantryman with a standard rifle, standard training, and no guarantee he would survive long enough to matter. But there was one thing that separated him from most of the men around him. He didn't treat shooting as the start of the job. He treated shooting as the end. Most soldiers in combat search for targets. They move, they scan, they react, they live inside the noise and try to win inside it. The longer they do that, the more their decisions become predictable, because under stress, humans default to rhythm. Fire, move, listen, fire again, repeat. This man did something different. He hunted patterns. Not the enemy's location, his behavior. That sounds like a small distinction until you realize how war actually works. Combat is not a chess match of equipment. It's a collision of nervous systems. It's people making the same imperfect decisions over and over, because their training and their fear push them into familiar grooves. If you can find those grooves, you can do something most soldiers never attempt. You can shape the enemy before the enemy ever sees you. By October of 1944, the Germans had been fighting Americans for months. They had watched U.S. units push hard and fast across France, loud with momentum, backed by artillery and armor, confident in movement. German patrols learned to expect certain things from American contact: aggressive suppression, quick advances, and when it came to snipers, a kind of impatience. A typical sniper kills, then relocates. A typical patrol hears a shot, reacts with fire, then advances to flush the shooter. Both sides understood that script. That's why the most important part of this story is not a man firing a rifle. It's a man watching what happens after a rifle is fired. Deep in that soaked forest, he spent hours doing what most soldiers don't have the nerve to do in a war zone. He stayed still long enough for the enemy to behave naturally. He watched German patrols move through the same trail. He listened to their spacing, their pace, the way they paused at the same choke points, the way their voices rose and fell when they believed they were safe. But the real insight came from something even simpler. He noticed their reflex. Whenever a single rifle shot echoed anywhere nearby, sometimes not even from him, the Germans reacted in a sequence so consistent it might as well have been printed in a manual. First, a freeze. Not long. Just long enough for the mind to ask, was that real? And, second, a burst of return fire, fast and angry, directed at sound, not sight. Third, silence, a tense pause. The moment where discipline wrestles with fear. Fourth, an advance, careful, methodical, rehearsed. To most Americans, that would look like competence. To him, it looked like leverage. Because a reflex that happens the same way every time is not strength, it's predictability. And predictability is the raw material of manipulation. He didn't need them to panic immediately. Panic is chaotic. Panic is noisy. Panic is hard to aim at. He needed something more useful. He needed them to investigate. That was the hinge. Animals flee, soldiers investigate. Once you understand that difference, you stop thinking like a man with a rifle. You start thinking like a man who can place an idea into another man's head and watch him act on it. That is what the Germans never considered. They assumed the danger was the shooter. They never considered that the real danger was the decision the shooter could force them to make. This is where most war stories lie to you, even when they're trying to sound true. They make the moment of violence the center of the story. A shot, a kill, a duel, a dramatic outcome, but real battlefield advantage often comes earlier. In the quiet minutes no one films and no one remembers. The minutes where a man decides how he wants the enemy to behave. Somewhere behind American lines, in a pocket of brush that smelled like wet earth and cordite, this infantryman made that decision. He didn't think, how do I hit them? End quote. Something that is ausbordade, he thought. How do I make them move the way I want? End quote. I stirred. Because once you control movement, targets appear without being searched for. They reveal themselves. They expose themselves. They walk into the geometry of your plan. The Germans believed they could flush out an American sniper by pushing pressure toward his position. That belief came from experience. It worked against men who relied on one nest, one rifle, one predictable retreat. But this man had already identified the blind spot in that logic. Their doctrine assumed a shooter must be attached to the trigger. If he could break that assumption, if he could create the appearance of multiple shooters without multiple men, he wouldn't just kill one patrol. He would poison the way an entire unit interpreted the forest. And once a unit can't trust what it hears, can't trust what it sees, and can't trust the direction danger comes from, it stops acting like a fighting force. It starts acting like prey. That's why the bootlace matters. Not because it's clever. Not because it's dramatic. Because it's the simplest possible way to separate a shot from the shooter. To turn a rifle into a stimulus instead of a weapon. To make the enemy respond to something that isn't there. This wasn't an idea that required strength. It required something much rarer in combat. Restraint. The willingness to let men walk, to let moments pass, to watch, measure, and wait until behavior becomes predictable enough to be exploited. And in a war defined by machines and mass firepower, that kind of patience looks almost unnatural, which is exactly why it worked. Because the German patrols moving through that forest weren't just scanning for Americans. They were scanning for the kind of threat they understood. A man behind a rifle, a single source, a single direction. They weren't trained to defend against a shot that had been detached from intention. They weren't trained to defend against the possibility that the forest itself could be made to fire. And they certainly weren't trained for the next step. For what happens when your own reflexes freeze, fire, pause, advance, are used against you like a rope? By the time the first German patrol stepped into that narrow trail again, boots sinking into mud, rifles up, eyes searching the trees, the American sniper wasn't preparing to shoot. He was preparing to make them investigate. Because once he succeeded, the forest would do the rest. The first mistake most people make when they hear this story is assuming the trick began with the bootlace. It didn't. It began with separation. Separation between cause and effect. Separation between sound and intention. separation between a rifle and the man who was supposed to be behind it. In every Army doctrine manual of the Second World War, one assumption was never questioned. A weapon fires because a soldier fires it. Training, counter-training, and reaction drills all rested on that belief. If you heard a shot, you responded to where you believed the shooter was. Suppress, advance, eliminate. That logic worked until it didn't. The American understood that he didn't need to defeat German firepower. He needed to defeat German expectations. And expectations are far more fragile than weapons. The forest gave him the first advantage. Sound behaved strangely there. Rain softened sharp echoes. Wet leaves swallowed footfalls. Tree trunks redirected rifle cracks, so direction became suggestion, not certainty. A shot didn't point back to its source. It smeared itself across space. Most soldiers treated that as a problem. He treated it as cover for an experiment. Before any trap was set, before any mechanism was built, he tested reactions. Not once, repeatedly. He fired single shots at long intervals, sometimes hours apart, sometimes days. Not to kill, but to observe. Each time, the German response was the same. Fire toward sound. Pause. Advance. No flanking. No wide sweep. No refusal to investigate. They always went forward. That told him something crucial. German discipline did not suppress curiosity. It organized it. Their training didn't tell them to ignore anomalies. It told them to resolve them. That distinction is everything. A soldier who ignores unusual stimuli is blind. A soldier who investigates them is exposed. And exposure is where control begins. The American didn't need them reckless. Reckless men behave unpredictably. He needed them disciplined, predictable, methodical. So he gave them exactly what disciplined soldiers cannot leave unanswered. An unanswered shot. The next step was not mechanical. It was conceptual. How do you create the appearance of a shooter without a shooter present? The obvious answer would be decoys, dummy rifles, false muzzle flashes. Armies have used those for centuries. But those tricks still rely on one assumption. Someone is still there. The American wanted something cleaner. He wanted a rifle to fire without anyone touching it. Not remotely, not electronically, not with anything that would look like engineering. Because complexity invites suspicion. Simplicity invites belief. He needed the trigger pulled by the environment itself. Something that could be dismissed as accidental. Something no doctrine warned against. Something that would never be listed as a weapon. That's where the bootlace entered the picture. It wasn't chosen for ingenuity. It was chosen for availability. It was already there, already familiar, already ignored. He tied the lace carefully to the trigger, not tight enough to fire, but taut enough to respond. He routed it through brush in a way that mirrored natural lines, branches, roots, bends in the terrain, so nothing looked intentional. The other end was looped around a branch low enough that a passing man could brush it without noticing. This wasn't a trap designed to kill. It was a trap designed to lie. Because when the rifle fired, it wouldn't fire when a man aimed. It would fire when a man moved. That difference mattered. The American didn't wait nearby. He moved, quietly, deliberately, far enough that the sound of the shot would never implicate his true position. From a secondary hide, he watched the trail. He waited. When the Germans came through, the sequence unfolded exactly as before. One man dropped to his bullet. Return, fire cracked back toward the echo. Silence followed. Then they advanced. That was the moment. One soldier brushed past the branch. The rifle fired. Another man fell. 2 shots, 2 directions, 2 outcomes no doctrine could reconcile. There was no immediate panic. Panic is loud and fast. This was worse. Confusion. Confusion forces the mind to work harder. It burns attention. It disrupts rhythm. And most importantly, it spreads. The Germans didn't retreat immediately. They froze. They talked. They argued in low voices about what they had just seen. A sniper team, someone suggested. No more than that, someone else said. That second shot didn't come from the same place. They did not know they had just been introduced to the most dangerous enemy in war. Ambiguity. Ambiguity is not fear. Fear pushes you away. Ambiguity pulls you forward. They needed answers. And the American understood that the need for answers would do more damage than the answers themselves. He didn't reset the trap immediately. He waited. He allowed the Germans to withdraw, to report, to talk among themselves. He allowed the story to grow. Stories grow faster than facts. By nightfall, rumors had already outpaced reality. Men spoke of shots coming from behind, of rifles firing without flashes, of positions that could not be located. The important thing is what the Germans did not do. They did not dismiss the reports. They did not decide it was an accident. They escalated. Officers ordered heavier movement, more men, more aggression, more pressure on the forest. Exactly what the American needed. Because increased pressure does not reduce uncertainty. It multiplies exposure. On the second day, he refined the system. He did not repeat the same setup. Repetition creates recognition. Recognition creates adaptation. Instead, he shifted positions, altered angles, changed distances. Sometimes the rifle was tied to a sapling, sometimes to a fallen log, sometimes to roots half buried in mud. Always subtle, always deniable. Each time, the same result. A shot with no visible shooter. A response aimed at the wrong place. Men advancing toward danger they believed they understood. The German patrols began to hesitate. Not enough to stop moving, but enough to break tempo. They argued more. They clustered. They waited for orders. That hesitation was the real kill. Hesitation collapses initiative. Initiative collapses command. And command collapse spreads faster than any bullet. The American barely slept. He barely ate. He wasn't exhausted in the way men are exhausted from fighting. He was exhausted from restraint, from not shooting when he could, from letting men walk when instinct screamed to fire, from holding the shape of the system together in his head. This wasn't marksmanship. It was control. By the end of the second day, the Germans no longer treated the forest as contested ground. They treated it as hostile ground. Something inside it was wrong, something they could not categorize. And when soldiers can't categorize a threat, they begin to invent explanations. A special unit. Hidden rifles everywhere. American infiltration behind lines. None of it was true, but all of it was effective. Because the American no longer needed to do much at all. The Germans were now doing the work for him. They moved differently. They reacted slower. They exposed themselves longer. They were no longer responding to reality. They were responding to the idea of being watched. And once that idea takes hold, the battlefield changes. It stops being a place where men maneuver. It becomes a place where men hesitate. That is when the kill count accelerates. Not because the shooter becomes more aggressive, but because the enemy becomes more predictable. By the morning of the third day, the American understood something that would define the rest of the operation. He no longer needed to create confusion. Confusion had become self-sustaining. Now all he had to do was decide how much damage to let it do. Because the next phase was not about traps anymore. It was about collapse. By the third morning, the forest had changed. Not physically. The trees stood where they always had. The trail still cut the same narrow line through the mud. What had changed was how the Germans moved inside it. They no longer walked with purpose. They paused too often. They listened too long. They reacted to sounds that weren't there and ignored signals that should have mattered. This was not fatigue. This was cognitive overload. The American had succeeded in something far more powerful than killing men. He had disrupted the enemy's decision loop. The Germans were no longer responding to events. They were responding to interpretations of events, and interpretations are fragile. A single unexplained shot can be dismissed. Two can be rationalized. But when shots appear to come from multiple directions, without pattern, without visible cause, the mind begins to search for structure where none exists. And when it fails to find it, it invents one. By now, German officers were convinced they were facing a coordinated sniper element, possibly a platoon-sized unit. Reports mentioned crossfires, overlapping angles, and firing positions that moved faster than men. None of that was real. But belief does not require reality. It requires consistency. The American understood this instinctively. He stopped thinking in terms of traps and started thinking in terms of signals. Each shot, Each pause, each silence, was no longer an action. It was a message. And messages shape behavior. He varied the timing deliberately. Sometimes hours would pass without a single round. Sometimes 2 shots would come within minutes. Sometimes the bootlace rifle would fire without a follow-up at all. The goal was not efficiency. The goal was ambiguity. Ambiguity forces the enemy to spend time thinking instead of acting. It creates internal friction, and friction kills momentum. German patrols began to change formation. Men walked closer together, then farther apart. Officers ordered more caution, then demanded speed. At one point, a squad halted entirely, arguing over whether advancing was safer than staying still. That argument alone was worth more than any kill, because it meant command authority was cracking. The American took advantage of that hesitation. He began to let patrols pass. This was the most dangerous phase of the operation, letting the enemy walk by. Knowing you could shoot, knowing every instinct urges action, this requires discipline beyond training. It requires trust in the system you've built. He waited until the patrol had moved past his position, then fired into their backs. One man fell. Then he vanished. Moments later, another bootlace rifle fired from ahead of them. Panic erupted. Now, the Germans believed the worst possible thing. They were surrounded. Men turned in every direction at once. Orders overlapped. Fire sprayed blindly into the trees. Ammunition vanished into leaves and bark. And still, they could not locate the shooters. Because there were no shooters. There was one man, exploiting their reactions. By midday, German units began refusing to enter the area without overwhelming cover fire. Artillery was requested repeatedly, but the terrain made it ineffective. Trees absorbed blasts. Shrapnel went nowhere useful. Worse, American positions were too close. Risking friendly fire wasn't an option. So the Germans did what armies do when doctrine fails. They pushed anyway. And pushing meant exposure. One squad attempted a rush, believing aggression would break the trap. They moved fast, shouting, firing wildly. The American let them go. He didn't shoot a single man as they advanced. That decision saved his life. Because the real kill came when they retreated. The moment fear overcame momentum, they turned back exactly the moment discipline vanished. That's when the American fired. 2 men dropped. Another bootlace rifle went off as the survivors scrambled back through the same trail. The survivors ran. They didn't stop until they reached their own lines. The story they told afterward mattered more than the men who died. They didn't say, "We were ambushed." 8-1. They said, "There are guns everywhere. Mine." That sentence marked the transition. The Germans were no longer fighting an enemy. They were fighting the environment. The forest itself had become hostile. This is the moment where most operations peak. The American did not let it peak. He slowed down. He understood that fear, once established, can be overused. Push it too hard, and the enemy adapts. Pull back too much, and it fades. So he modulated. Some patrols passed untouched. Others lost a man or two. Sometimes a bootlace rifle fired without anyone dying at all. Those empty shots were critical. They reinforced uncertainty without providing answers. Men began reporting hearing shots with no casualties. That was worse than death. It meant danger existed, but was unpredictable. Soldiers stopped trusting silence. They stopped trusting distance. Every sound mattered. Every movement felt exposed. By late afternoon, German officers attempted to reassert control. Orders were issued limiting investigation. Patrols were told not to advance toward unexplained fire. This should have solved the problem. It didn't. Because now the Germans faced a paradox. If they didn't investigate, they ceded ground. If they did investigate, they lost men. Either choice resulted in failure. The American exploited this perfectly. He fired shots that demanded response, but punished it. He allowed silence to stretch long enough to provoke curiosity, then struck when discipline cracked. The Germans were trapped inside their own doctrine. And doctrine, once broken, is difficult to repair under fire. By the evening of the 3rd day, the situation had deteriorated beyond tolerance. German command received conflicting reports. Some units claimed heavy losses. Others reported none. Maps showed no clear enemy positions. The common factor in every report was the same: confusion. When command cannot understand the battlefield, it loses the ability to command. That night, the order came down: pull back. The forest was to be abandoned. No one argued. When American forces advanced later that week, they found the aftermath: bodies scattered through the trees, expended shell casings everywhere, abandoned equipment left behind in haste. The physical evidence told one story. The psychological evidence told another. An entire unit had been forced to retreat not by force, but by uncertainty. And at the center of it all was one man who had barely moved. He hadn't outshot the Germans. He had outweighted them. He had allowed their own instincts to betray them. And he understood something that would not be written into manuals for decades. In war, the most dangerous weapon is not the one that kills the fastest. It's the one that makes the enemy stop understanding what's happening. Because once understanding collapses, everything else follows. By the end of the third day, 64 German soldiers lay dead in a strip of forest shorter than a football field. Not because they were careless, but because they were trained, and someone had learned how to use that training against them. The American didn't celebrate. He didn't count. He didn't even stay. He simply left the forest the way he had entered it, quietly, knowing the system had reached its natural conclusion. The operation was over, but the lesson was not. Because what had happened there wasn't a trick. It was a demonstration. And the implications reached far beyond one rain-soaked forest in western Germany. What finally broke the German command structure was not the number of men lost. Armies have absorbed worse and continued to function. What broke them was the absence of reliable information. By the time the retreat order was issued, German officers were no longer debating tactics. They were debating reality. Reports coming in from the forest contradicted each other so completely that they could not be reconciled into a single picture. Some patrols reported fire from the front. Others swore shots came from behind. A few claimed rifles were firing without visible shooters at all. To command an army, you need more than courage or discipline. You need certainty. And certainty was gone. The American understood this long before the Germans did. That was the real objective: not body count, not territory, not even delay. He was destroying their ability to decide. Every army operates on a loop: observe, decide, act. When that loop breaks, firepower becomes irrelevant. Men hesitate. Orders arrive late or contradict one another. Initiative disappears. That is what the forest had become: a place where observation was punished. German officers attempted to restore order using standard methods. They centralized reporting. They demanded confirmation before action. They restricted movement unless explicitly authorized. Each measure made the situation worse, because every additional layer of control slowed response time, and every delay increased exposure. Units now waited for orders that never came in time. Patrols paused at trailheads, unsure whether advancing would trigger another invisible threat. Officers stepped forward to observe personally, only to expose themselves. Several died that way. Those deaths carried disproportionate weight. Losing enlisted men erodes morale. Losing officers erodes structure. When officers die during verification, command learns the wrong lesson. They stop verifying. And when verification stops, command becomes blind. The Germans were now blind inside terrain they had once controlled. They began describing the forest not in tactical terms, but in emotional ones: cursed, unclean, dangerous beyond reason. That language matters. It signals a shift from military problem-solving to superstition. Once soldiers start attributing outcomes to forces they can't categorize, rational planning collapses. Doctrine loses authority. Orders become suggestions. The American watched this happen without ever hearing their reports. He could see it in movement alone. Patrol spacing widened, then tightened. Advance times shifted unpredictably. Units avoided the same trails that had once been considered safe. Most telling of all, the Germans stopped adapting. Adaptation requires understanding. Without understanding, all you can do is react. And reaction is always slower than intention. The American now had complete control of tempo. He chose when the enemy moved. He chose when they stopped. He chose when they exposed themselves. Sometimes he fired only once all day, sometimes not at all. Those were the most effective days. Silence became a threat. The Germans waited for something to happen, and when it didn't, they filled the void with imagination. That imagination did more damage than any shot. By now, the bootlace rifles were almost irrelevant. They had served their purpose. The system no longer required reinforcement. The Germans believed rifles were hidden everywhere. They believed movement itself could trigger death. They believed they were being watched constantly. Whether any of that was true no longer mattered. Belief had replaced evidence, and belief drives behavior. The final stage of collapse came quietly. German command issued an order limiting forward movement in the sector until the sniper situation could be resolved. That phrasing revealed the truth. They still believed the threat was a sniper problem. They never realized it was a perception problem. They sent no dedicated counter-sniper teams. They didn't isolate firing angles. They didn't attempt broad denial tactics. They pulled back. And in doing so, they confirmed the American success. When the retreat began, it wasn't orderly. It wasn't panicked either. It was something worse. It was hesitant. Units disengaged slowly, watching flanks, covering shadows, reacting to every sound. Equipment was abandoned not because it was heavy, but because stopping to retrieve it felt dangerous. This is how control dissolves. Not in explosions, but in small decisions driven by fear. When American infantry advanced days later, they encountered no resistance. The forest was quiet. The trail lay empty. Bodies remained where they had fallen, some days old, some untouched. There were no signs of a desperate last stand, because there had been none. The Germans hadn't been defeated. They had disengaged from a fight they could no longer comprehend. The American walked away without knowing the final outcome. He didn't need confirmation. He understood systems well enough to recognize when one had failed. He left behind no signature, no notice, no markers, no proof. Only an absence, an area the enemy refused to enter. That is the highest level of battlefield control. And it came not from force, but from subtraction. Subtract certainty. Subtract trust. Subtract the ability to interpret signals. Once those are gone, everything else follows. By the end of the operation, 64 German soldiers were dead. That number would be repeated in reports, whispered in recollections, and eventually turned into the headline of the story. But that number misses the point. The real damage was invisible. An entire unit lost the ability to operate confidently. An entire sector became unusable. Time was bought. Space was held. Momentum shifted. All without a firefight. All without escalation. All because one man recognized that war is not won by controlling territory. It is won by controlling understanding. And that understanding, once broken, is far harder to rebuild than any defensive line. The forest didn't kill those men. Their need to understand it did. By the time the forest fell silent, the operation was already over. Not because the American had decided to stop, but because the Germans had decided they could no longer continue. That distinction matters. Wars don't end when one side runs out of men. They end when one side runs out of confidence in its own decisions. And that is exactly what happened in that narrow stretch of forest in western Germany. The Germans never understood what defeated them. They counted bodies. They marked positions. They argued over how many snipers must have been involved. They searched for complexity because complexity made the outcome easier to accept. What they never considered was that the mechanism had been brutally simple. There had never been a sniper team. There had never been hidden rifles everywhere. There had never been a sophisticated deception unit. There had been one man, one rifle, and one idea. And the idea was not mechanical. It was psychological. The American did not win because he could shoot better. He did not win because he had better equipment. He did not win because he was more aggressive. He won because he understood something most armies still struggle to admit, that soldiers do not respond to reality. They respond to interpretation. Every reaction the Germans made, every advance, every hesitation, every retreat, was driven by how they interpreted incomplete information. The American never needed to control what they saw. He only needed to control what they thought they were seeing. Once that happened, the Germans defeated themselves. This is why the bootlace matters. Not because it pulled a trigger, but because it severed the link between intention and action. A rifle firing without a visible shooter is not just confusing, it is destabilizing. It forces the mind to search for explanations that do not exist. And when those explanations fail, discipline collapses into doubt. Doubt is lethal. Doubt slows movement. Doubt fractures command. Doubt turns trained reactions into liabilities. By the third day, German soldiers were no longer reacting to shots. They were reacting to the possibility of shots. They no longer trusted silence. They no longer trusted distance. They no longer trusted their own training. An army can survive fear. It cannot survive uncertainty. And that is the real lesson of this story. Not that a bootlace can kill, but that perception can. The American never intended to create a legend. He didn't name the tactic. He didn't record it. He didn't even speak about it afterward. To him, it was not innovation. It was survival. Another stretch of ground held long enough for the war to move forward. Another unit delayed without a major engagement. Another problem solved quietly. He walked away exactly as he had fought. Without recognition, without celebration, without witnesses. When American forces later advanced through the area, they found only fragments. Shell casings scattered through the trees. Abandoned gear left where men had dropped it and never returned. There were no signs explaining what had happened. And that absence is fitting, because the most effective ideas in war often leave the least visible evidence. They don't announce themselves. They change behavior. This is why stories like this are rarely taught. They don't fit clean narratives. There is no charge to describe, no dramatic duel, no clear moment of victory. There is only a gradual unraveling that becomes obvious only after it is complete. Histories tend to focus on weapons because weapons are tangible. They focus on leaders because leaders are visible. They focus on battles because battles can be mapped. But wars are often decided somewhere else. In the space between stimulus and response. In the assumptions soldiers carry with them into the field. In the habits doctrine builds and the blind spots it creates. The Germans in that forest were not careless. They were not incompetent. They were not weak. They were disciplined. And their discipline depended on rules that had never been tested against deception that looked like randomness. The American didn't break those rules. He let the Germans obey them. That is why the kill count rose without escalation. That is why command collapsed without a decisive engagement. That is why an entire sector became unusable without being conquered. The war did not change because of this operation, but the men who survived it did. They learned, painfully, that not every threat announces itself. That not every danger can be located. That sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the one firing the rifle, but the one shaping the decisions you make after you hear it. And that lesson outlived the forest. Because long after the rain stopped, long after the bodies were cleared, long after the war moved on, the principle remained. Control perception, and you control behavior. Control behavior, and you control outcomes. That is what the bootlace really was. Not a trick, not a gimmick. A reminder that in war, as in life, the most powerful weapons are rarely the loudest. They are the ones that change how people think, before they ever realize they are under attack. The war moved on, as wars always do. New orders replaced old ones. New fronts opened. New names filled reports. What happened in that forest faded quickly, absorbed into the endless machinery of conflict. The American never wrote about it. There was no after-action report detailing the method. No doctrine update. No official recognition. To the men around him, it was simply another dangerous stretch of ground that had been held long enough for something else to happen somewhere else. That was enough. He survived the war. He went home. He disappeared into civilian life like millions of others who carried experiences they never felt the need to explain. But the lesson didn't disappear with him. It stayed, quietly, in the margins of how war is actually fought. Long after rifles changed, after radios replaced runners, after forests gave way to cities and signals replaced sound, the principle remained untouched. People do not react to reality. They react to what they believe reality is. Every army builds doctrine to manage that belief. Every soldier is trained to interpret the battlefield in specific ways. Those interpretations make action possible, but they also create blind spots. The American never exploited a weakness in German firepower. He exploited a weakness in certainty. He understood that when soldiers can no longer trust what they hear, where danger comes from, or why events are happening, they stop acting decisively. They hesitate. They second-guess. They wait for clarity that never comes. And hesitation is fatal in any conflict. This is why the story matters. Not because of the number 64. Not because of a clever mechanism. Not because of a single man in a forest. It matters because it reveals something uncomfortable. That even the most disciplined force in the world can be defeated without being outgunned, simply by being made to think incorrectly. Modern warfare has new names for this now. Decision cycle disruption, perception management, cognitive warfare. But the idea is the same. If you can force the enemy to respond to the wrong problem, he will exhaust himself solving it. The Germans never solved the problem in that forest because the problem was never physical. It was conceptual. They were trying to locate shooters that didn't exist, responding to threats that were never where they thought they were. They weren't defeated by fire. They were defeated by interpretation. And that is why no monument marks the site. There is no plaque explaining what happened. No preserved weapon behind glass. Just trees, mud, and a trail that looks like any other. Because the most effective victories rarely leave visible traces. They leave changed behavior. The American understood something that historians often miss. That the battlefield is not just terrain. It is a collection of human minds, trying desperately to make sense of incomplete information. And if you can influence how those minds interpret the world, you don't need to dominate the battlefield. The battlefield will collapse on its own. That truth did not end with World War II. It didn't even begin there. But for 3 days, in a rain-soaked forest in Western Germany, it was demonstrated with brutal clarity, not by a new weapon, not by superior numbers, but by patience, restraint, and the understanding that the most powerful force in war is not fear. It is uncertainty. And once uncertainty takes hold, the outcome is no longer decided by who has the bigger gun. It is decided by who understands the human mind first.